Okay, good morning. So we are moving into our last two chapters of Finance 1. We'll be doing Chapter 8 and then Chapter 17. Chapter 8 gets into budgeting. So we're going to, and the main focus from a problem perspective is working on variance analysis. So today I'm going to talk to you theoretically about budgeting and some of the strategic and operational importance of budgeting. And this is stuff you need to know and understand as you go into an organization. And this doesn't matter whether, I know some of you want to do public health, some of you want to do a variety of different things. Every organization has a budget, doesn't matter what it is, right? So it's really important to kind of get an understanding of what budgeting really is. And so I'm going to talk through some of that for you. Most of this is going to be most of today is going to be kind of general knowledge kind of stuff that I think is important for you to know. And then we're going to get into variance analysis, which is the technical portion of this chapter. And it looks harder than it actually is. And there's a couple of simple rules if you can remember. The math is not that complicated, but it is easy to get wrapped around the axle if you're not paying attention. So today we'll talk primarily about budgeting. And then Chapter 17, we kind of go back to financial accounting again, and we get into metrics and ratios that real organizations use to track the efficiency and of their organization, both from a financial perspective as well as from an operational perspective. And so I teach a physician leadership course, or teach into, I don't teach the whole thing, I teach the finance portion of it. And I was just doing that, did 2 different sessions while we were in session this fall, talking about how different, boards use this data. So the Chapter 17 is really important. The take-home exam, the exam 3 is going to be a take-home exam, and you're going to do it in teams. Obviously I have not written it yet, but it will be a little bit different than the historical exams, because historical exams that I have up there were done in person, in class, with a time limit. So I'm going to be giving you a time limit, but it'll be a generous time limit, probably 8 hours as opposed to 2 hours. So you'll work with your team to work on it. My plan is for it to have some more case components to it. So it'll be, like I said, it'll be a little different. It'll be a little more involved than what you would do if you were in a regular in-class exam. So we'll talk more about that as we go. Let me shut off my email. I'm not getting pinged. So let's talk about Chapter 8, and we'll talk more about other stuff later. So as we think about budgeting, it isn't just, how much money are we going to spend. You need to think about any organization. They have some sort of mission, right, and vision, which you hopefully have talked about in management. We've kind of, I think, brushed over this a bit in this class because it just permeates the organization. But this is, mission and vision. These are all the statements, right, of what the organization is saying it's supposed to do. So if you look up Wentworth Douglas or Boston Children's or any healthcare organization, it's going to have a articulated mission and vision, and of all the great things it's supposed to do, right? So Wentworth Douglas's mission is probably something like to take care of the health of the seacoast community, something like that. And there are inevitably these kind of grandiose, statements of intent, right? And then over here, and it's kind of like, if you've ever listened to your, like, not you guys probably, but like you listen to your parents or some older folks, and they're talking about, like, this year I'm going to lose 20 pounds and, and I'm going to get in shape and all that, right? Well, that's kind of like a personal vision, right? So every year I say, my wife and I say, we're going to, this is the year we're going to get back in shape and, get back our 20-year-old, bodies and yada, yada. And so then you've got like, the statements, and then over here you've got the actions of the organization. Right? So there's this gap between what we say we're going to do and what we want to do and what we actually do. And maybe that's a bad example, but I'm trying to be a little bit humorous. But every organization has some especially not-for-profits have this idea of we're going to save the world. That's our mission, is to do everything. And then over here, and then you look at what they actually do. And so like if you've ever even tried to set a New Year's resolution that you're going to do something differently this year, right? Do your actions actually match your rhetoric? Well, in reality, we can say a lot of things that we really want to do, but there are resource limitations. Right, resource limitations that stop us from maybe doing all the things we would like to do. So, Boston Children's would like to end all childhood illness, right? And that's something along the lines of their mission. But they don't have enough money to do that. If you gave them all the resources in the world, you gave them all the doctors, all the money, all the nurses, all the whatever they might need, they might be able to actually do, all of what they envision. But the reality is there's never enough resources to go around to do everything we would like to do. And so the connection between mission, vision, and the rhetoric of the organization and what the organization is actually able to do is the resource allocation. So resource allocation, resource limitations, resource allocation. And so, Wentworth Douglas, let's think smaller. Wentworth Douglas wants to ensure the health, as they start to adopt a population health kind of mission, right? Which focuses, instead of focusing on providing care, they're focusing on the health of the community. I mean, you could spend billions of dollars trying to get the health of the community of just an area like the Seacoast. And so you have to try to put your money, you have limited resources, and so you have to try to put your money where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, where you're going to get the most benefit toward, the most movement towards your mission. And so that's really the budgeting process. Right? This is not how your book expresses it, but this is how I think about it. Right? The budgeting process is the effort to get resources to the most important missions, I should say, of the organization. And that was really what fired me up about being a CFO, right? In my day, and what got me interested in being a CFO once upon a time was when I was a practice manager and when I was doing other work before I moved into the finance field, what I saw was the CFO sat at the table with the senior leadership, and the senior leadership had all this rhetoric about, these are the things we want to do. We're going to do, so this is a military organization. So we're going to take care of, we're going to make sure that our soldiers are ready to deploy at a moment's notice in top health condition. And we're going to, I'm thinking in particular, I used to work at Tripler Medical Center out in Hawaii, which was a teaching hospital. So they had all these missions. They had the mission of readiness of, and so they provided tertiary care to Pearl Harbor, the naval base there. There's an Air Force base there. There's a Marine base there. And so they're like, we got to take care of all the, all of the medical needs of the Pacific, for all the active duty. Okay, so that's really important. And then, we've got like 100,000 retirees that have retired to Hawaii. So we've got to make sure that we provide population health to our veteran population. And then, well, we've got this, we've got all this medical training that we're doing, and we've got to provide top medical training to, world-class medical training. And then we're going to do, and there was like this laundry list of all the things they were going to do, right? And then my boss was the CFO, and he's like, well, what's actually like the most important thing? Because while that all sounds really great, and we should really do all that, we don't have enough money to do all those things in the way that you all would like to do them. So how do we figure out what's the most important things of that we can actually put into place, because there's not enough resources to do all of the rhetoric, right? To put into action all of the rhetoric that you're talking about. So that's and so that to me was like the most exciting part of being in finance was sifting through, not making the decision necessarily, but talking to leadership, being at the table, having that conversation about, okay, yes, everything you have just listed is important, and everything you've listed, none of it is a bad idea. All of it is good, right? But we don't have the resources to do it. So which of these things, leaders, are we going to actually do? Right, and that was the process, the real budgeting process, is what does the organization actually get to do? And there's an interesting, so having come out of the federal government, I was involved, we got our budget from Congress, right? And so there is every year, the way that budgeting works in the federal government, and you've probably heard these words, and maybe you don't know what they mean, but it's kind of important as a citizen to know this process. So the equivalent at the federal level, when Congress is meeting to put together the $3 trillion that Congress spends each year, or that Congress creates this budget for the federal government that the federal government then spends. The first step that the budgeting process in Congress is actually kind of a two-step, I'm being very simplified, but a kind of a two-step process. The first step, and I'm thinking in particular of the Department of Defense, there is a Defense Authorization Bill, right, that gets put together. So it's called the Authorization Bill, Defense Authorization Bill. And that kind of is the equivalent of this stage. These are all the things that we think the Department of Defense should do, right? And so we authorize, so what the bill kind of reads something like this. The Department of Defense is hereby authorized to have an army of 400,000 men and women. The Department of the Navy is authorized to have 200,000 sailors and 80 ships. It's surprising how few ships the Navy actually has, by the way. The Army, by the way, just as a point of humor, the Army has more ships than the Navy does. Just our ships tend to be really tiny, and the Navy has really big ones. But we have a lot of like little landing craft kind of things. Anyway, that's just a little like inter-service competition kind of thing. We also have more aircraft than the Air Force does. So we have more helicopters, but anyway. So Congress first passes the authorization bill, which is basically like the good idea bill, right? These are all the great things that we would like the military to do, like broadly, because this is defense, not just Army, but defense. And so there's this whole list of things that and they call themselves the authorizers. So it's a whole list of things that the authorizers say that we would like to do. So maybe it's, like this is kind of all of the good ideas, right? And then the next step is a appropriations bill. The appropriations bill takes the authorization bill and says, okay, authorizers, you said that we should spend $800 billion on defense. We have now, we've taken the defense authorization bill and put it next to the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education and the Department of yada yada yada, right? And we have all of the proposed authorizations for the entire federal government, and that amount is $5 trillion. And we project that we're only going to have $3 trillion. So we can't appropriate, meaning we don't have enough cash to fund all the good ideas. So we're going to, from your good ideas, which were the authorizations, right? We're going to actually fund, right, this subset, right, of what you have proposed that we authorize. The key here is, so you have authorizations and then appropriations, right? The key here is that the appropriators can't fund things that the authorizers haven't authorized. So if the authorizers say something like, we should have 5 aircraft carriers in the defense authorization bill, the appropriators can't say, nah, let's do 6, right? Or, or we should do something other than aircraft carriers. We should have, a drone something, right? The appropriators have to choose, like the authorizers basically create this list of possibilities, and then the appropriators choose from the list of possibilities the things that they're actually going to put money against. So that's kind of, every organization does this. This is kind of how the federal government actually works. You're going to hear when you listen to the news, right, and you hear about when you hear the journalists talking about what's happening in Congress, you'll hear them talk about authorization bills and appropriation bills, and so now you know what that means, right? The authorization bill are all the good ideas. And I'm being a little flip with it, but that's essentially what it is, right? This authorizations are all the things that we think we should do, and then the appropriators are like, okay, all good ideas. We don't have enough money, so here's what we're actually going to do: is this subset of what you guys have thought was a good idea. So that's kind of so that's your policy lesson for today, by the way, but in a very big picture, this is how organizations really work. So let's talk more from your book's perspective. So your book says, all right, we have this thing called a strategic plan, right? That says what are the organization's mission, right? Why are we here? So this mission is, why are we here? Why do we exist? Why is Wentworth Douglas here? Why is it a non-for-profit entity? What is its purpose for existence? Then we have a vision, typically, and that vision is, where are we going, right? What are we going to try? Why are we here? Where are we going 5 years from now? So typically, the strategic plan is it is big picture, right? Very big picture, very high level. So the strategic plan is not going to say stuff like, we should have 10 nurses on Ward 3B, right? It's going to say something like, we want to continue to provide inpatient care so that members of the Seacoast community do not have to leave the community. Like this is actually, that would be a better statement for something like one of the small critical access hospitals up in the North Country. Like so, so I'm trying to think who you guys have met. I guess I haven't had many folks, senior level folks, talk to you, but I'm thinking of like Mike Peterson up in Androscoggin Valley Hospital, which is up in Berlin, New Hampshire. So for those of you guys that know the North Country, right, way up north, very small town, right, and so it's the hometown hospital. So part of their strategic plan would be, we want to continue to provide inpatient care, right, for the Berlin community, so that they don't have to go to Dartmouth, or they don't have to go to Portland, right, to Maine Med, or they can stay and get their care in the community within the scope, right, of what our practice is. So that strategic plan, that mission, right. So if you're a critical access hospital, right, you guys talked about that. You know what a critical access hospital is? Less than 26 beds, less than a 3-night stay, more than 50 miles from the next nearest hospital. Those are kind of the three purposes. A critical access hospital, CAH, right, is really meant to provide that that community care in a community, with the recognition that they get special funding, in particular from Medicare. Right, with the recognition that if they didn't get this special funding, they probably wouldn't be able to survive. But a critical access hospital is different than a community hospital, is different than a medical center. Right, a medical center typically provides GME, graduate medical education. So a medical center is typically, you think of like your Boston Children's, your Dartmouths, right, where they're doing research. They are training doctors. They have residencies, right? Not every hospital has a residency program. So you have doctors going through general surgery training, going through, cardiology training, and so forth, right? But a critical access hospital doesn't do that, right? So part of a critical access hospital's mission is to provide, basic emergency care, for example. This would be mission, right? Basic emergency care. Basic inpatient care, maybe OB, right? So that way you don't have to leave the community and have your baby. Whereas, say, Dartmouth, or a medical center, an academic, in particular, an academic medical center. So I'm talking mission. Academic medical center isn't going to be focused on this. It might be, to train the next generation, of physicians, right? It might be to provide world-class care. Whereas, so Dartmouth Hitchcock probably says something like, and I should have pulled up their mission statement, but if you pull up the mission statement of Mass Gen or a academic medical center, it's going to be something like, we're going to provide world-class, cutting-edge care, do research to find cures to the next, major disease, yada, yada. Whereas a critical access hospital is like, we just want to make sure that we can provide care to our community, so that people in our isolated community don't have to go to drive 50 miles if they've broken their leg. Right? That's the difference between, a mission, the mission statement of a critical access hospital versus an academic medical center. So when you declare your mission, right, it's these big picture things. Again, it's not down in the weeds, right? And then you start to get into operational. So you have kind of strategic plan, and then there's a linkage down as you start to kind of get into the weeds more. You get into operational planning. This starts to get into, and this is very much at the board level, right? So this is the board of trustees or board of directors, is the organization, is the level of decision making where they're talking about the purpose of the organization. That's the function of the board, right? The CEO participates in that, right? The chief executive participates in that process, but it's the board that makes those decisions. Then the senior management team, here's where, so board, here you have the next kind of layer down where you're starting to get into articulating how is it we're actually going to do these things. So these are more near-term objectives, right? So we have this objectives, not objections. I'm starting to write objections, right? So we have these, kind of broad statements of mission, train the next generation, or provide basic care. Then we get into operational planning, which starts to set these near-term objectives to execute on the strategy. Right. So this is typically done in a 3 to 5 year plan, and it sets specific goals. With measurable metrics. Right. So what does that mean? So if it says something like we're going to retain OB in the community, then we'd want to measure how many live births, what is the quality of our patient experience, how many people are leaving our community to get care somewhere else. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to try to measure, right? And we're going to set goals in our operational planning. And then so we've got the operational plan, the strategic plan yields the operational plan, and then the operational plan is used to form the budget, right? So budgeting then actually assigns financial resources to the objectives set out in the operational plan, right? So it's all kind of nested like those Russian nesting dolls, right? One inside of the other, inside the other. So kind of like what I was talking about, right? With the authorization bill and the appropriations bill, you can think of the strategic plan as the authorization, the authorization bill, and then as we move down to the budget, that's like the appropriations bill, where we're actually going to do the things. Here are the resources that we have to actually do the things we said we want to do. So you should understand that. You're going to hear a lot of discussion about strategy and strategic planning. You don't hear people say operational planning all that much, but that's in reality what's happening kind of behind the scenes. And then you have the budget, which is typically, the budget is typically a 1-year document. So whereas the operational plan is a 3 to 5 year document, you typically have your budget is on an annual cycle, right? And it's tracked monthly, quarterly, and annually. So the budget is on an annual cycle, and that annual cycle is called a fiscal year. And it just makes us finance people crazy when people say a physical year, like you're going to go get your annual physical. This is a fiscal year, okay? So please don't say physical year. People just you'll make your finance people want to poke their eyes out. So a fiscal year is the year that an organization operates on. And you're like, well, what's special about that? Well, what's special about that is the fiscal year does not have to be a calendar year. So it is common to see a fiscal year especially for small companies. It is common for a fiscal year to be Jan 1 to December 31, right? But in reality, corporations can choose their fiscal year. So, for example, UNH fiscal year is July 1 to June 30. And why would that be?
Because that's when the students aren't here, so they can do the.
Well, right. I mean, but yeah, some of it is, yeah, we just, we if I used to say this kind of same thing when I was working in a hospital, if it weren't for all the students, we could run a really good university, right? And same with if it weren't for all the darn patients, we could run a great hospital. It'd be very efficient. But with a university, most universities run like a July to June, and it's because in between here is like the July, is your school year, right? So you guys show up at the end of August and you leave at the end of kind of mid to late May. And so we've got a little bit before you show up and a little bit after you show up. We can kind of close out the books after you leave. So the primary business of UNH happens between these two dates. And it's meaningful to think about, right? Whenever you look at our annual calendar, it's the 2021 calendar, or it's the 21-22 calendar, it's the 18-19 calendar, right? And so we do, and you all think of like, what's your junior year? Well, your junior year is running from August of 20 to May of 21, and when you come back, you're going to be a senior, and that's going to run August of 21 to May of 22. And so it's a meaningful way to think about a fiscal year for a university. The federal government fiscal year, oh, by the way, it's abbreviated FY, fiscal year, runs October 1 to September 30. And I actually don't know the historical significance of that, but it's just how it's been, how it always was. So every year we would run as we went to close out our budget on September 30th, we would be trying to close out our books, and I'd be hanging out with my budget staff, and it is a common thing for the CFO to bring in Chinese food on September 30th because it's New Year, New Year's Eve, right? So, all right. So there are. So the thing to realize is corporations. You as an individual, your fiscal year is a calendar year. A lot of small corporations run on a calendar year, but a lot of larger corporations set their fiscal years in different ways. A lot of hospitals match their fiscal year to the government's fiscal year because the government is 60% is their major payer, and they get 60% of their revenues from the government. So there's a method to the madness there. So let's talk about kind of the cycle, the annual cycle, budgeting cycle within the fiscal year. So if we assume a calendar year for this purpose, kind of mid-year, in that April-May timeframe. So you're in that 4 to 5 months into the year. Your marketing department starts its work on its next budget. So we are preparing. So we're 4 months into, say, the 2020 fiscal year. We're starting work on the 2021 budget, right? So April, May timeframe, if we're on a calendar year, April, May of 20, we're starting to work, the marketing department is starting to gather data about local and national economic factors, right? So the marketing department is gathering information about local, national economic factors that will impact demand. For services and reimbursement. So a lot of times we think of, when I say marketing, a lot of people, we tend to think about advertising or public relations, but marketing is actually mostly about, not about public affairs and public relations. It's about understanding your market. Now, a lot of this work is done. Organizations might have a strategy department. They might have a strategy officer, a chief strategy officer. Wentworth Douglas has a strategy office that does most of this work. And so they do the analysis. And the chief strategy officer just took over as the CEO with the retirement of their longtime CEO. So the chief strategy officer has stepped in to take charge with that. But they're doing an analysis. They're doing stuff like changes in demographics, right? If you're a small town like a Valley Regional Hospital up in Berlin, if a new employer comes into town, that could have a major impact into the utilization for your hospital. Coronavirus, right? They're starting to try to make projections now, right? So, well, not now. This would have been back. They would be thinking about back in May. They'd be like, all right, will we have a vaccine? Will we be able to go back to 100% operations? Will we need to have special considerations in place that reduce our capacity? All those kinds of questions they're asking, even as we're just getting into the year, even as we're in the 4 to 5 month period. So April, May, we're starting to do that analysis about demand. So we're trying to come up with how much do we think we'll get you? What is our utilization likely to be? So that's April, May, June, July. So mid-year. Operating departments. So this is your, nursing units. It's your imaging department. It is your OR, cath lab, all these areas. Start to prepare requirements for equipment. All right, this is some discussion about capital budgets. So equipment is capital. Right, these are the things that are going to be depreciated as opposed to just expensed. So requirements for equipment and operating costs. So this would be, think supplies, right? Manpower. So the operating departments are preparing their own budgets at their level, saying, all right, The marketing department pushes down data to them saying, we think demand for your service is going to be up by 10%, down by 10%, about the same, whatever the marketing department kind of decides, they tell the operating departments, this is what we think is going to happen this year for you. Then the operating departments say, all right, well, if that's the case, we're going to need an additional nurse, or we're going to need 10% more supplies. Or it might be, we're flat, but what we're seeing is supply prices are going up. So you need to know that going into our plan. We think we're going to need 5% inflation instead of 2% inflation. Or you might look at the equipment, which is a common thing to do. So we'd have in the Army, we called it logistics, but our capital equipment management, there's going to be a department in the organization that tracks the age of all the equipment, and they may look at the repair costs, right, of the equipment. And so maybe you've got an X-ray machine that's 10 years old, and we're spending significant amounts of money on maintenance on it. So now the question is, should we replace that piece of equipment, or should we keep running with it and keep repairing it? And so we've got to make that decision. So those are things that start to get discussed kind of at about the mid-year point, right? Now all that stuff starts, especially the capital, in that August, September timeframe. So now we're 8 to 9 months into the fiscal year. We aggregate up, in particular, the capital requirements. So finance reviews capital requests, and capital is often tied to, going back to that mission, right? If we've got an evolving mission, if we've got in our operational plan, we're planning to be more aggressive about expanding a service. So, for example, Wentworth Douglas bought a big piece of land over on Pease in Portsmouth, and they're building a huge expansion of their outpatient capacity, right? So that would have been part of their operational plan, right? Their strategic plan would have been to say something like, long term, we want to expand our ability to take care of the Seacoast population. The operational plan would have said, well, one of the ways we're going to meet that goal of expanding our care of the Seacoast population is we need to offer more outpatient services. And so we're going to expand and build on Pease, right? And so somewhere in, as we built these, both a current year budget as well as a long-term financial budget, we would have had to been allocating money going forward. And so here we're finalizing requests for new capital to maybe expand, whether it's to expand services, right? Expand services, or replace equipment, right? Old, worn out equipment. So there are two reasons we would spend on capital, meaning equipment. One would be we've got old equipment that's wearing out, so we've got an X-ray machine that's breaking down, we need to replace it, versus, we really want to double our capacity for MRIs, for example. So finance aggregates all this. So all this stuff rolls up from the departments up to finance. Finance aggregates it, and then there's a discussion, right, with the senior leadership about where should we put the money for capital that best meets the mission. Because you're going to have leaders in departments that maybe aren't a priority for your mission. And those leaders are going to want money for their projects. And you've got to be able to say to them, no, we value you, but we have limited resources, and we're going to put our money, our additional resources that we have in a higher priority department, and you're just going to have to make do with what you have. So then we're getting into that 10, 11-month point in the fiscal year, October, November, we're now finalizing budgets at the department level, both operating and cash budgets. And what's the difference between operating and cash budgets? Remember, we operate on accrual basis. And so, and the organization needs to have cash. So the operating budget is going to take into consideration, is going to look at operations. So, you know, if we do services, we do 1,000 visits in June, we don't actually get paid for those visits until sometime in August, typically, right? So our cash budget is different from our operating budget because of our accrual basis accounting. So you know, 2 months before the end of the fiscal year, the next fiscal year's budgets are being approved, are finalized for approval. And then in December, final review of the budget by the executive team, and then approval by the board is the final step. And one of the important things is the board shouldn't be drilling down too far into the budget. That's the job of the executive team. That's the job of management. The board should be looking at the budget at that kind of high level, right? Saying, what we said we wanted to do is this. Have you done a good job providing resources so that what the organization is going to actually be able to do are doing as much of the good ideas that we had, right, that we set out to do? Have you made as good a plan as possible, given the reality that we don't have unlimited resources? And I got to say, that's the coolest part about being a CFO, is being involved in this process, right? Because if you are involved in this process, you're talking to everybody in the organization, right? You are, you know, as we go through this process, you are talking to every department chief, you're talking to a lot of the service chiefs, so people below the department chiefs, right? Talking about, well, what is it you want to do? Why is that important? How does what you're proposing move the mission forward? And that's a really cool place to be, because everybody wants to talk to you, first of all, because they all want to sell you their idea. Like, this is why I'm really important. And you're like, well, you know what? You know, Caitlin, you're not that important, but Taylor, you know, Taylor's really more important, right? So it's kind of it's a fun place to be, because a lot of times, one of the things that, you know, as you develop technical skills in this kind of work, you're able to help department chiefs who are docs, or even maybe some other administrators, articulate their story. Because a lot of times the docs don't know how to tell their story in a way that is going to come through and be understood. And so I used to spend a lot of time with my my physician leaders, kind of listening to what it was they were trying to say, and translating that into finance terminology so that they could put their best case forward. And that was a really important way that I created credibility with them, because when I came back to them and said, you know, we don't have the money to do this great idea thing that you wanted, or I heard, you know, we heard you, but we're going to give you 10% less than what you asked for, they at least felt like they'd been listened to. And that's really important, right? That's where the finance meets the management, right? If your leaders don't feel like they're being listened to, and then they don't get the resources that they ask for, they just become very resentful and they don't feel like they can accomplish what they're setting out to do. Whereas if you listen to them and they feel like they were able to make their best case with your help, and it still comes back that, no, you can't have all the things that you wanted, they are much more motivated to be like, okay, I understand, and we're going to do the best we can with with what we've got. There's a big difference between you didn't listen to me, you didn't take me seriously, and now you gave me this pile of crap, as opposed to you listened to me and I understand why I didn't get what I asked for, so I'm going to do my best, right? You as a finance person can make that difference. So it's a pretty cool area to be in. So that's kind of the the cycle of budgeting. There are a couple of different kinds of budgeting, so I'm going to talk about two of them, and they don't, and they are kind of, imagine they're kind of extreme poles, and reality is that we exist someplace in between. So let me go back to my screen. So on the one extreme, we have kind of conventional budgeting. Which you can think of as prior year plus inflation. And on the other extreme is what's called zero-based budgeting. And they're kind of on a continuum. The reality is most organizations are about here, right? If this is pure conventional budgeting and this is pure zero-based, most organizations are kind of a little more over here towards conventional budgeting, but they do engage in some zero-based kind of hybrid, if you will, budgeting over time. So what does this mean? Well, conventional budgeting basically says, look, Chloe, you were running the imaging center last year. You had a budget of $2 million. We think that inflation this year is going to be 3%. So we're going to give you $1 million plus 3%. So that's what, $1,030,000 this year. So that's your budget. Yay, we're done, right? And so the plus side of that, of course, is, well, so with conventional budgeting, the process starts with the prior year budget as baseline, and the new budget basically is the old budget. So new equals old budget plus inflation. So the plus of this, of course, is that's wicked easy, right? I could just throw it in a spreadsheet and multiply everything by 1.03 and we're done. Yay, right? And I can go play golf. The downside of that is, well, what if for whatever reason, imaging was decreasing in volume for some reason, right? Maybe we've got two imaging centers. Maybe Chloe runs her imaging center in Dover, right? So this is, think of Wentworth Douglas. So maybe Wentworth's got an imaging center in Dover at the main campus, and they've got an imaging center out at the new Pease outpatient location. And the Pease location is growing really fast, but the main campus one, not only is it not growing, but maybe some of the work is shifting out to Pease. If Chloe runs the main campus Dover location and Cole runs the Pease location, right? And we just give Chloe a 3% plus up, even though her workload is down by 10%, and we give Cole 3% plus up, but his workload is up by 20%, we have really misappropriated resources, right? because Chloe's needs have declined and Cole's have increased. But we've basically just used the old budget that reflected the old levels of workload. So there's the drawback of conventional. If you're doing pure conventional, is you're perpetuating the funding based on old assumptions. So that's why I say that, most organizations are not stupid. They're not going to do that, right? They're going to be well aware that workload is shifting from from Chloe's operation to Cole's operation, and so they're going to make some decisions. And that's why I say this is kind of the extreme conservative basic approach as opposed to zero-based. So the plus of this is it's less work. So plus is it's less work. The minus of this is it carries forward old assumptions, right? So what about zero-based? Well, what's zero-based? Zero-based says we throw away, we pretend nothing, we don't know anything about the organization, right? And we start all over again. So start from scratch. As far as the budget, start from scratch, meaning we don't look at prior year's spend, except to maybe get costs, right? So maybe to get our cost per unit. But we start from scratch and we evaluate workload, demand. Ideally, we look at the operational processes. Right. So if we have this change between Chloe's operation is decreasing by 10% and Cole's is increasing by 10%, right? We might look at, well, Chloe, do you really need as many people as you had last year? Can we maybe cut the number of hours you're running your operation so that we can reassign people over to Cole's operation over at P's? So we're looking at those operational processes, and we're not assuming that we need the same resources, whether that's manpower, supplies, even equipment, maybe, right? Maybe we can pull a X-ray machine out of Dover and send it over to Portsmouth to meet the new needs of the P's operation, right? So those are all things we're thinking about as part of the budgeting process. So the key here to remember is the budgeting process is not just about money, right? It's about taking the operational goals of the organization and giving them resources. So don't think, when you think budgeting, don't think cash, right? I mean, cash is obviously important, and we measure everything in dollars, but it's not really about money. It's about resources, right? And it's about resourcing the operational goals of the organization. So zero-based means you go from zero, right? Everybody gets a zero budget, and you have to argue for every penny that you get. And so Chloe has to come in and sit next to Cole, and Chloe's like, "Well, you should give me my $1 million," and they're like, "Well, no, you have to actually justify everything, Chloe, this year," and so you're like, so she's like, "Well, I feel like I need $1 million," and they're like, "Well, your workload is down by 10%, so we don't think you need $1 million. So let's look at, how many people do you actually need to do the number of scans and tests that you're doing?" And then Cole comes in and says, "Well, I'm doing 10% more MRI scans, so I'm going to need another technician so that I can extend my hours past, I was running, 5 days a week. I think I need to add Saturday hours. And so in order to do that, I need an additional technician," right? That's the kind of discussion that you have in a zero-based budgeting process. It eliminates, my boss used to talk about fat, right? There was fat in the budget that if you carry over from year to year, maybe in the past somebody needed some additional resources, and then we just kind of never went back to take those resources back, and they just keep getting them year after year after year after that. And so the zero-based process goes back and leans out the organization, cuts out the fat of the organization. The problem with this, I think, is probably obvious. It's a huge effort, right? It's a huge effort. It takes time, right? So this is, the downside here is huge effort, because, and it's a huge effort not only by the finance people, but by, Chloe's team and Cole's team and, and the marketing team coming up with all the numbers. And it's a big effort. It takes a lot of resources. Right, in particular, management and analytical resources. To do this, right? It takes Chloe and Cole away from managing their day-to-day operations to come in and make this detailed case. So, and it may not actually result in all that big of a savings, right? So, but organizations usually go through sort of a zero-based exercise, maybe on a 5-year basis. You just don't, we've talked about this a lot in this class. You're always asking, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Are we going to generate enough savings from this process that it justifies all the additional resources? And so from a finance, dude perspective, right, we're all like, yeah, let's do zero budgeting. It's going to be awesome, right? And all the managers like, oh my God, I don't want to do that again. And so it's because it is such a time-consuming and resource-consuming process. So like I said, most organizations are somewhere kind of in the middle, probably a little more towards the conventional side, in the sense that, when it becomes really obvious that workload is shifting or changing between organizations, they take a hard look at particular operations. So in any given year, the organization might spend a bunch of effort looking at imaging, but not bother with OR much, right? So, and that's because the OR volume might not have changed much. And so what's the point of doing a whole zero-based thing if things haven't really changed all that much? So we can also, in addition to thinking about types of budgeting from kind of a conventional and zero-based, you can also think of budgeting from kind of top-down or bottom-up. So top-down is, not particularly participatory. Right? You don't get to listen a whole lot. Everything flows down, from the strategic plan, right, and is fed to the departments. The flip side is in bottom up, right? Budgets are developed by the departments. And then aggregated. This has a similar upside downside to conventional and zero-based, right? With top-down, if I, got a great finance team, got a great leadership team, we look carefully at the volumes of the different departments, and we come up with an appropriate budget, and we push it down to the managers and say, all right, Cole, you've got it. This is the money you've got for the year, right? And so that doesn't demand very much of Cole's time and effort. He may not be particularly happy with the outcome, right? But it doesn't take him away from his day-to-day work. So that's the plus side. The downside is Cole's not particularly invested in the budget because he didn't have much input in the budget. With bottom up, it's up to the manager, right? So, Linnea is managing the ED. She's the executive director of the ED, right? And we say, okay, Linnea, prepare your budget. Here's your last year's budget. Here's your volumes. Tell us how you're going to try to save money and at the same time do more work and generate more revenue for the organization. And we're going to aggregate that along with Chloe's, budget and Lauren's budget for, for the billing operation and Krista's budget for facilities, right? And each of you is going to work on your own budgets. And then we're going to aggregate all that up and we're going to review it and decide, do we have the resources necessary to fund the budget requests from the departments? And we might not. Chances are we won't, because you're going to ask for more money in aggregate than we have as an organization. So I'm going to have to, even after you do all that great work, I'm going to turn around and tell you that, yeah, that was nice. You're still going to get, less than what you asked for, which can be frustrating, right? Because you're like, I've invested all this time and effort, and then the CFO comes back and says, well, thank you for all your effort. Here's your budget. And then you're like, but that's not what I asked for, right? So there's kind of pluses and minuses to that. All right, let me see. So a couple of other abstract ideas, and then next time we will spend a lot, the next two classes we'll spend a lot of time looking at, I'm gonna have a spreadsheet that I'll send out to you guys, and we will work through that. So in reality, there is some, again, even here, there is some kind of, in between role where, there's some top down going on, some bottom up going on. These are kind of the two extreme ideas. So there are a few different types of budgets, or, you could think of them as budget processes. Your book calls them different types of budgets. I think of them as kind of stages in the budget process. So we have what's called a statistics budget. And you'll see examples of this in the textbook. And we'll look at that next time. But a statistics budget basically specifies the volume and resource assumptions in the budget. So it's volume and other assumption, other quantitative assumptions. So workload, right, would be, outpatient visits, imaging, scans, for example. It will be lab tests, right? It's all the things we can measure in terms of discharges for inpatient, right? Maybe if you've got inpatient psych, it might be days of care, because psych bills on a day on a per diem basis, right? So or if you're say a long-term, I tend to think hospital, but if you're like a long-term care facility, days is really important because that's how you bill, for long-term care. So we've got this statistics budget, which captures all our volumes that then drive a bunch of our other assumptions. So we start with the statistics budget, then we have a revenue budget, which is built around, it combines volumes, right? The volumes from the stats budget with reimbursement assumptions. So here we're going to have thought about things like payer mix. Right, like, has our payer mix changed? We know that commercial payers pay better than government payers. So commercial payers like Cigna or um, uh, Harvard Pilgrim or Blue Cross all pay better than Medicare, which all pay better than Medicaid. Um, right? And so has our payer mix changed? If not, then we can kind of stabilize our reimbursement assumptions. And so we say, well, we're expecting to do 1,000 visits and we're expecting to get reimbursed at $100 per visit. And so our expected revenue is going to be $100,000. That's the kind of thing we're doing in the revenue budget. It may include assumptions about fee for service versus capitated, right? So we've talked about these things quite a bit. Fee for service versus capitated. And then in today's market, we're not going to talk a whole lot about this in this course, but we have risk-based reimbursement too. Right, which is kind of is a form of the capitated budget, but this is a lot of where where the ACOs hit, right? Where you're not full capitated, but you are, if you can reduce medical spend for your insurers, you might get some shared savings, and so all of this stuff has to be incorporated into your expectations about your revenues. Paper here. Don't want my pen to bleed through to my desk. And then we have, so of course if we have revenues, we have to have expenses. So we have an expense budget. And that's going to combine volume again. From stats budget, right? And it's going to focus on things like salaries, because salaries are our single biggest expense in healthcare. And we're going to look at FTEs, full-time equivalents. You should definitely know what that word, that you should know that acronym, because you're going to live by that acronym when you get out into the real world. An FTE, a full-time equivalent, does not mean an employee, right? An FTE is measured by a certain number of hours of work, depending on the organization you're in, and depending on how they measure that and what one FTE is. I want to say in the government, we used to use 1,640 hours. There are, if you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, that's 2,080 hours. But in reality, nobody actually works 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. Everybody takes some sick leave, some personal time off, right? Everybody goes to training. Everybody does these different things. And so for military FTEs, I think we use 60 and 40, because military people were always going off and doing military training as well as trying to. So if you have a military doctor in a military hospital, the military doctor's doing healthcare, providing healthcare, but they also have to go off and do readiness training to be able to be prepared to get deployed at any given time. And so, so you don't get as much work out of say, if you're in a military hospital, you don't get as much work out of a military doctor as you do out of a civilian doctor, because the civilian doctor doesn't have to do the military readiness thing. So it depends on how you measure. My point here is an FTE, there, your organization is going to have a rule based on number of hours as to what defines what an FTE is. But an FTE doesn't necessarily mean a person. One FTE might be made up by 2 part-time people, right? So your number of employees typically exceeds your FTEs. So you might have 600 FTEs for an organization, but you might have 750 employees, right? Because a lot of the nursing staff works part-time. A lot of the, maybe a lot of the Cleaning staff works part-time, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. So we're going to be calculating salaries. We're going to incorporate things like depreciation that we've talked about, and then all the other stuff that makes up both our fixed and our variable costs that flow into that. Okay. So we've got our statistics budget, our revenue budget, our expense budget, right? The operating budget kind of combines all those things together. Stats, revenue, expense, right? So all the, all the cost assumptions up here. When we're doing a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of assumptions built into this at the beginning of the year, because at the beginning of the year, we're making a guess. We're making a guess about our reimbursement rates. We're making a guess about our volumes, and we're making a guess about our costs, right? And all those things may not be correct, as we're going to talk about. And that's where we get into variance analysis. And then from this, we build a pro forma P&L, profit and loss statement, right, based on all these assumptions. So we built this pro forma P&L. And so that is kind of all the background that we'll need, because next time we will start looking at stats budget, revenue budget, so forth, and we'll start talking about variance analysis, because like I said, in reality, when we make all these great plans based on all these great assumptions that we make, and then then reality hits, and the volumes aren't what we thought they would be. Maybe they're more, maybe they're less, right? Maybe they're more in one area and less in another area. The reimbursement rates are different than what we thought they would be. Maybe they're down, maybe they're higher than what we thought. Maybe they're higher in one area and lower in another area, right? The costs are all different depending on, do we have COVID, right? So if we have COVID, all of a sudden we've got huge costs that we weren't anticipating and lower volumes than we were anticipating, right? And so we have all these different things. So we have this great plan at the beginning of the year, and then, who knows what happens during the course of the year. So, all right. So next time we will continue on with this. So we will have class on Tuesday of next week. Obviously, no class on Thanksgiving. So I will see you again on Tuesday. No pre-practicum on Wednesday. So we'll just have Tuesday class next week. All right. See you guys. Have a great weekend. And I will have your exams back by tonight. All right. All right.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.